If you guys want to turn on your videos for this part, you can, but it is not necessary. Hi. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so thrilled to see all of these people popping in. It's so exciting. So my name's Katya Ozvitsky. I'm one of the co-hosts. Well, I am one of the co-hosts, but I'm also a co-curator of Cosmic Trace, along with Carrie Reardon and Ricardo Harris-Fuentes. The three of us are gonna, take you through the process of curating the show and how we know the artists, and then we'll introduce ourselves a little bit, and then we'll give each of the artists about 7 to 10 minutes to speak about their work that's in the show. Ricardo is in the space, which is wonderful. So he's going to be, we're going to highlight him and the artists when they're speaking about their pieces that are in the show. And if you have any questions, we would just ask that you hold those until the end. You feel free to put them in the chat. I can help ask those questions once everybody's had a chance to speak. So I will, should we give it one more minute or should we just get it started? 7:04.
7:04?
I think get started.
I think we should get started. Okay.
Yeah.
So I will, I'll hand it over to Carrie to introduce herself and talk about two of our wonderful artists.
Thank you. Thanks all everyone for coming. I'm really excited to see so many people here. And thanks for joining us to hear a little bit more from these amazing artists. We, like Katya said, are just gonna give a brief introduction because we want this to be more about obviously the artists and their work. So I think the way we're gonna run through this, as she just said, we're going to give each artist about 10 minutes. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So I guess I will just start with Astri. I know the artist Astri Swendsrud from a mutual friend of ours who's actually here, Sarah Peterson. And she took me to a performance of the Semi-Tropic Spiritualists many years back. And this is a collaborative project that Astri has with her husband, Quinn. Oh, I'm sorry. No, but can you turn that down a bit? Sorry, I have a 3-year-old and she's battling me for the sound. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay.
You're great.
She just cranked it up. All right, so
It's so adorable. Don't
All
worry.
right, so anyway,
we're fine.
her and her husband, yeah, her and her husband Quinn have this amazing side project, Semi-Tropic Spiritualists, as well. And I think you guys have been working on that since 2012. And I've just always loved how your performances and objects both tap into systems of belief, ritual, and ideas of spirituality that are both fantastical and real. And I always find that this blending has been very interesting. And I think you actually nailed that with your new drawing that you made for for the show. And it also turns out that Astri and I are both from Minnesota. And she also runs another artist-run space called Elephant. And I bring that up because I had a show there in 2019, which is actually how I found out about Mary Beth Heffernan. I have to turn this down 1 second, I swear.
It's very cute. Well, you know what? I can jump in and actually.
Right. I'm back. Sorry,
You're back. That was fast. Okay.
It was really crazy. All right. So through that show that I had, Nova, please no. All right. Well, through that show at Elephant, I met the amazing Dr. Amy Lyford, who is one of the performative subjects in Mary Beth's Ashes works. which she's showing in the show. So she and Mary both work at Occidental College, and I actually felt super lucky at that time that Mary Beth had her whole series, well, a lot of the series up of Ashes at in the gallery at Occidental. So I was able to go and view all of this amazing, breathtaking work that which is actually shown right behind her, some of the larger images that are a part of this series. And really, like, just walking in, I just remember how disorientating and how breathtaking you feel when you're looking at this work. It's like conceptually charged, at least for me, with so much emotion in regards to like human existence, the body, and ideas of mark making. And this can be seen through your process and how you made these prints, as well as like the material choices I think you chose with this series. So we actually had a show lined up for you right before the pandemic hit, and then it got canceled. So when Katya and I were actually talking about this new curatorial show, Katya and I were talking about different ideas of things, and we started talking about ideas of energy. And Mary Beth's work was still very much ingrained in my head, and I thought it worked really well. So it sort of actually was a jumping off point for the show, was thinking about her work in regards to this. So that is how I know the lovely Astri and Mary Beth. And then I will give it over to Katya for how you know the other two artists, and then we'll hand it over to the artists.
Okay. Well, actually, technically, before the show, I only knew Melissa really super well. And we met through mutual friends who, I think it was actually Daniel, a friend, an artist friend of ours in San Diego. So I've known her for a couple of years. And actually my husband and I co-run an artist run space, not dissimilar to Elephant, the space that Astri runs. And we have taken Melissa's work to Copenhagen, and I've always just sort of kept my eye on her practice, and I'm really excited to put her on a show in LA. And I think with her work as well as Mary Little's, what drew me to it, I was actually thinking about this. I think everybody in the show, essentially, if I were a collector, this is the kind of work I would be collecting and putting in my home. So, but I think for me, with both of their works, it was the combination of kind of a science mind and a design mind coming together to talk about organic processes and the body and kind of the way we perceive the world and make sense of it. So I actually didn't know Mary Little personally, but I had seen her work. She somehow Noisky Projects, our project space, got put on her email list through our friend Camilla Taylor. And it was really serendipitous because I got an email a couple of weeks before we were starting to put the show together. So I had you in my mind. And then it turned out that Ricardo knows her super well. So maybe, Ricardo, do you want to say a few words about Mary Little, our fourth?
Sure, about Mary Little.
Artist.
I'm a huge fan of Mary Little. We are friends and neighbors, actually not too far, probably about a mile from the Bendix building where the Tiger Strikes asteroid gallery space is. And what can I say? I'm a huge fan of her work. It's been wonderful to be a part of this project and to see the connections between all of the artists' work. So, I think it was a little bit serendipitous that, that I jumped on board. Should I talk a little bit about TSA now too? Should I do
Yeah, great.
So I'm part of a new group of artists who joined the collective in January of 2022. And so basically, if you guys don't know, it's an artist run exhibition space, a nonprofit that has 4 other locations, one in Chicago, one in New York, Philadelphia, and Greensville, North Carolina. I forget which Carolina. but basically we mount, I don't know, 8 exhibitions a year. Each artist is given a slot, or groups of artists are given slots. I was not originally planned to, it wasn't my turn yet to be a part of an exhibition, but I think we're now creating sort of helpers that help with exhibitions. And so I jumped on board, and then, discovered that Mary was one of the artists. And, for me, it's just been such a gift. I mean, one of the things that the pandemic really brought home to me in the various lockdowns is the importance for community and connecting to people, and, getting out of isolation. And it became really clear that I needed to be a part of a community, actively engaging and meeting new people. And already on the first show, I've met just a host of really incredible artists, curators, and other, fans of the group. So it's been a really wonderful experience. So yeah, I think that's all I have. And there's noise here too, because our sister gallery that shares the space with us is doing some stuff next door. So
Yeah. Well, I think I will just tell you that you probably already know the show is called Cosmic Trace. We started we were looking at Mary Beth Heffernan's work first, and jokingly we're referring to the show as Cosmic Foot for a long time, which was a really kind of a funny way for us to. It was actually, let me back up. What Carrie mentioned about the thesis of the show, which is, we were talking about energy and the body, and the way I particularly like to curate is I don't feel like the work needs to all speak on the same theme in the same way in order to fit together. And I see these 4 artists as sort of like, if we have like a triple Venn diagram, I feel like each of them fits 2 portions of that diagram, whether it's work about the body or work about figuring out information or patterning, or some combination of those things. So I think perhaps we should start with Mary Beth, since the Ricardo's got the camera pointed to her. So I'll give it over to her.
Wow, thank you so much, Katya, Carrie, all of my fellow artists, and Ricardo, and all of you are here tonight. This work, I had been engaged with a previous series of cyanotypes that were also photograms. And so I'd been interested in this intimate form of image that can only be produced through a haptic experience or a haptic touch. And among my questions on that previous series, I was trying to create a kind of mutual space for these 2 figures, one that belonged to the living and one that belonged to the dead. And I wanted to kind of create a phantasmagoric space where they might coexist in this brief time and space. So when I moved on to this series, I was asking myself questions about what are the limits of the body reading as a body? When is a body not a body? So I did a lot of thinking and reading about dust, and about cremains, about the fact that it's ground up bone. So I was thinking about the physical state of the body, but also in the long-standing interests of my practice, I was also thinking about representation, and about what are the kind of minimal states of an image in itself. So it occurred to me that the end state of a body, reading it as a body that is cremated remains, was an awful lot like a kind of proto-digital experience of an image that is black and white, presence and absence, ones and twos. And so I found myself in a conversation about corporeality, about the nature of images. And then in around this time, this very dear friend and colleague, Dr. Amy Lyford, the surrealist art historian, and I, who had been in really a career-long discussion together around these issues, our mothers died within 6 months of each other, and both of us were present when they died. And so this is a particular, if one is to talk about representation and traces, that's a particular kind of relationship, with a heightened, I guess, sense of traces and inheritances. And so I approached Amy, whose mother was cremated. My mother was embalmed and buried. And I asked Amy if I could use her mother's cremains to make photograms. And she agreed. And we went through this amazing process of informed consent. Amy is very process-oriented in her research and in her teaching. And I had just been through a social practice project that involved intensive informed consent. And so we went through the process as both, I think it was as much a ritual amongst ourselves of coming to a shared agreement about what to expect from this experience, what the potential harms could be to her, what the potential benefits could be. And so together, before we even entered the darkroom, we entered a kind of shared space of conversation and exchange about what was at stake here. So Amy had lent me her mother's cremains, and I made some initial images that I considered kind of aleatory, involving chance and me scattering. And they were almost too pretty. They looked like Milky Way, like galaxies. And I thought they lacked a kind of tension. And I wondered what was missing. And I realized it was Amy's body that was missing from these images. And so I made the difficult approach at that point to ask Amy if she'd allow me to shower her body with her mother's cremated remains. And that's what gave rise to this series that you see both behind me and in the pictures that are featured, the hands and foot images that are in Cosmic Trace. So I spent an entire summer building a kind of Brobdingnagian darkroom so that I could make 8-foot-long prints. These are gelatin silver prints. I knew I wanted black and white. I knew I needed the precision of a black and white instead of, say, the cyanotypes. I didn't need all those aqueous artifacts. And I really wanted a sense of precision and also an image that was intimate, that could only be made through touch. And through that touch and negative, that white negative, say, absence of light that instantiates the presence, through this conundrum of presence and absence, dead and alive, touching and absent. I felt like that whole entire process embodied the conundrum of this complex relationship of the end of life and what it's like to be caught up amongst the living and the dead.
Wow, just incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you again for holding out and being a part of this show. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Carrie. Thanks
Yeah.
for having me.
So happy to have your work in it.
It really, I think maybe we should go to Melissa next, because I feel like this work in particular, what is it that defines a body, because her work is a lot about DNA analysis, and I feel like we can go from human cremains to the molecular structure of a body.
It makes so much sense because of the digital aspect or proto-digital aspect.
Exactly.
Too. Yeah.
And also, the evolution of the processes. But I'll let Melissa get into that part.
You can talk about it. That's fine.
No, it's all you, girl. Go for it. Let me spotlight you.
Yeah. So this work is part of a body of work called Smallest of Places that focuses on DNA analysis in relationship to forensic science. Just to give a little context, most of my work is conceptually based within some sort of science topic. For a long time, it was more in the astrophysics field, because that is my side hustle as a science illustrator for NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory. But as my practice sort of developed, I started kind of thinking about outside of that box. And ironically, I went from this very macro lens to this very micro lens. And the way that I sort of wound up there is that my practice in my studio, sometimes form brings out the function. So if I'm in my studio, I could just be in a state of play and start experimenting with materials and techniques. And when I sort of get to a technique that really interests me, I begin to look at those images and wonder where I can connect them within the science realm. And so if you go to that first one on the left, Ricardo, I kind of
I apologize, it's in reverse, so I'm getting confused.
No, it's in. Oh, it's in the right way for us.
Okay.
So I was sort of having this play with charcoal, with gravity. And in that play, I was creating these images and I was wondering, okay, what do these bring out to me in science? And I had this deep, long recognition with maybe something related to DNA, and I couldn't quite remember what that thing was. I'm like, a readout of DNA? What is this thing? And so I went to Professor Google, of course, and I just started typing in DNA black and white images. And that's when I realized it's something called an autoradiogram, which was a technique for reading DNA when they first started doing DNA analysis. And it's kind of like these black and white bands where each band represents a nucleotide in your DNA that's been separated. And so thinking about DNA, I really wanted, I had immediate connection with the ideas of DNA connecting to identification and how that process then is informed within the justice system and how that plays out in the justice system. And so I began this deep dive on sort of the history of DNA analysis within the forensic science, and for good and for ill. And thankfully within that process, I met a woman that's working at the crime lab here in San Diego. And so she helped me understand where the science was and where it's going. And so that's basically what you're seeing here right now. On the left is where the science began in the 70s with the autoradiogram. In the middle is where the techniques are right now in the crime labs, using something called short tandem repeats, which are patterns within DNA that they read and match up with suspects. And then on the right is where private companies are going with the use of DNA databases and using that in tandem with AI and writing programs to actually read DNA. So to get into a little deeper with each one of them, the one on the left is sort of based on that autoradiogram that I was talking about. And when that was introduced into the court system, the likelihood a piece of evidence, the DNA that they read from a piece of evidence is going to match a suspect was like 1 in 100 or 1 in 200. And at the time they were like, oh, this is great. This is like, oh, the chances that it's somebody else is like 1 in 100, but that's actually really horrible. That's really horrible. And nobody like so many, it could be their cousin that lives around the block. It could be, this second family. The likelihood that it's somebody else was way too high for it to actually be able to convict people with that technology. But now in the crime labs, the technique reads more parts of your chromosome. So now it's, if you have a piece of DNA in evidence, the chances it's going to match a suspect is 1 in 10 to the 15th power, which is 1 in a quadrillion. So the possibility, if it matches your suspect, the possibilities that it's somebody else is actually pretty low. So that's better, and I think that having tools like this do help a lot within our justice system, because it kind of gets us away from the like eyewitness accounts, which are very false and wrong the majority of the time. And I've actually had experience with that. So but however, if you look at the piece itself, there's still sort of like this messiness, this organicness, even though it's trying to get some organization, it's trying to get some variety in it. And that's because there's still people that are analyzing the data. There's still people taking the data. There's still people physically removing DNA from an item and having a process where humans are involved, right? So there's still mistakes that can be made, and it's not necessarily the technology that's making the mistakes, it's still the humans, right? But then we get to the piece on the far right, and that is about what a company called Parabon is doing. They're doing something called phenotyping. And what they can do is they can go out on the street and they can take a piece of gum and read the gum with their processes using the AI that they have. And then they can draw a person's face, whoever was chewing that gum. They can actually draw their face because they can read their hair color, their eye color, the shape of their face, their skin tone. So that's where we're going with this technology, which is pretty incredible, which on one hand, it does talk about the conversation of getting equity in new ways within our justice system. But then on the other hand, we can start talking about law and who is making law and who has the rights to these sort of technologies. And I worked with the woman that started the company for this piece in particular. So the piece itself, it's hard to see in this video, but it's made up of text and, you can kind of, a little bit. Yeah, there you go. You can kind of see it. Text and numbers and symbols and stuff. So this is actually the actual code that's used for these processes that's been encrypted, like an encrypted version of it. It's a very small part of the code, because I really talked with the woman that started the company and wrote the original software in order to do this. And yeah, and I was like, can I have a piece of your code? And she was sort of confused why an artist would want that. But I really like this idea because behind this text, it's cut out. And so behind it is a mirror. So as the viewer is approaching it, you can see your reflection in there. And it's sort of, because for me, this is like a representation of taking your image, like taking a piece of you, or, and who has control over this, who has control over this. And right now it's this company, and they work with the government, they work with the military, they work with local officials, so it's like, it's important for us to think about like our DNA is data. We get worried about like social media and how they're using our data and how they're using our information. Well, this is like sort of another step in that whole process of like, what is private, what is not, and what are the systems doing with our identities. So yeah, so I think that sort of kind of covers that whole process. Hopefully I didn't get too sciencey in there.
It was the perfect amount of science, I think.
You like
I
science?
find it so fascinating.
Yeah.
And I feel like the only way to sum it up would be like, in the right hands, or you want to make sure that this information is not in any, not used for evil purposes. But yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but I mean, that also begs the question is like, what are evil purposes? I think we think that's a black and white conversation, but it's not. Just like this technology is not a black and white good or bad thing. I think it really is sort of a gateway into sort of greater conversations that can go kind of, in a philosophical direction if you get too deep in the weeds.
Totally.
But yeah, thanks so much for letting me talk about it, and then also show it in the space, which is awesome, with these other amazing artists who have beautiful work. And I think the show looks amazing. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for being part of it. It's been such a pleasure to have everybody. I think I would like to go to Astri next, because I really feel like actually this really got my gears going again, hearing like collecting information, I feel like is really relevant to Astri's work.
Definitely.
Yeah, and it's actually there's going to be Astri did a drawing, and also she has the 2 sculpture pieces, the transmitters.
Sorry, I had to get the pedestal to just steady myself because my arms are, you guys can probably tell, shaking. So.
Yeah, if you want, I can just pull up an image of the drawing.
And actually, Ricardo, if you wouldn't mind maybe starting with the sculptures, I think I'd like to talk about those first and then transition into the drawing. And
thank you, Ricardo. I'm sorry, your arms are probably.
I know.
Sorry, I just threw that pedestal in there. Maybe that's messing up the show. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
But yeah, I am. First off, thanks so much to Carrie and Katya and Ricardo and to the other artists for this whole experience. It's really been wonderful. And I'm glad, Katya, that you wanted to talk about my work after Melissa's, because I think there are a lot of really interesting interconnections there. Okay, I think maybe I still need to be pinned as the speaker here instead of Melissa. I'm realizing on the screen. There we go. Awesome. But, like her work, I'm also really interested in this body of work in thinking about sort of invisible forms of communication, or how we receive and make interpretations on information. So the receiver sculptures were originally part of a solo show that I had this past fall at Irenic Projects in Pasadena. And the title of that entire show actually was The Receivers. And these pieces came from a motif that I started working with after experiencing this space of a radio transmitter tower. I made my transmitters out of fireplace matches, and then they are coated and wrapped in, on the one hand, copper leaf and copper wire, and then the other transmitter has tin foil and a steel wire. And I was thinking about these as sort of symbols and devices for communicating information in invisible ways and transferring that into a form that we can take in. And then in the material choices, I was also really thinking about, on the one hand, kind of like ad hoc devices for trying to tap into other dimensions. They're very deliberately kind of wonky in their construction and made out of materials that are not actually going to be functional as receivers, but are tapping into this sense of kind of like the, you know, conspiracy theorists tinkering away with their devices in their basement or trying to market some new kind of listening or transmitting device. The tinfoil is a bit of a nod to the notion of the tinfoil hat, but it is also then a reference with the tin on the one sculpture and the copper on the other as the component parts of bronze. And I was thinking too of these two towers as being kind of analogous to the bronze twin pillars of masonry, with that being another sort of historical reference point that has to do with secret knowledge or secret information, and that in a lot of the kind of popular imagination taps into conspiratorial ideas around secret societies and who is pulling the levers of power in the world. And so as part of the exhibition this fall, these sculptures were also accompanied by a large series of drawings. One of them is wrapped up behind me there, that were titled Wallpaper for Conspiracy Theorists. And those drawings involved a lot of patterning, as well as imagery and visual information that sort of created these compositions that were both diagrammatic and symbolic. And I thought of them as compositions or images that were meant to be overinterpreted. A lot of the source imagery for those compositions came from me just doing a lot of looking at esoteric imagery coming from a variety of like religious or occult traditions. But I was also looking at a lot of psychedelic imagery, as well as sci-fi imagery, and then creating slightly warped or adjusted versions of those images to be compiled into these overall sort of wallpaper patterns. Moving on now to the piece that's on the screen here, which is a new drawing I created for this show. I was so grateful to have the opportunity to recontextualize the transmitter sculptures as the starting point for a new body of work, this being the first drawing in that series. And there I was thinking about taking some of the same motifs like the transmitter, as well as still a lot of patterning and surface, attention to surface and color and shape and form. But in this case, creating, rather than sort of diagrams, instead creating spaces that were able to be inhabited in a really different way. So the title for this piece, which you can see there, "You're standing on a brick path. To your right, you see a door, but the way is blocked," came from thinking about like early computer games and text-based adventures, the way that information was used to situate you as a player, or in this case, a viewer, as kind of the protagonist of the image. And the imagery here also pulls from a slightly later generation of like computer games or video games, like 1 point perspective maze games that I definitely played a lot of as a kid in the 90s. And the way that it would sort of place you into these digital landscapes where you were trying to like solve a mystery or gain access to a new space or collect various forms of information. And so I'm interested in the way that this body of work, which I'm continuing to develop beyond just this drawing, becomes a way to make the viewer the protagonist of the image. And if the other images, the previous series of drawings were about making images or that were meant to be overinterpreted, excuse me. In this case, I was thinking about getting you over-involved in an image that you are supposed to then overinterpret. And all of this connects back to some of the larger interests in my practice that have to do with how do we as humans deal with the unknown, or try to fill in the gaps of that which means mysterious or out of our control or beyond our knowledge. So I was thinking within this imagery, which also plays a lot on, like, once again, fantasy and sci-fi images. I had a friend describe this piece to me as like looking like the coolest trapper keeper in the world. And I was like, yes, I'm kind of into this as a reference point, just these like fantasy worlds that can be indulged in, and thinking about the way that at times those can provide a healthy analogy or a form of escapism, but they can also be the space where like a conspiracy theorist sees themselves as the protagonist of a fantasy that they are creating for themselves. And as we see far too often these days, those things can have some really complicated and dangerous real world impacts. So yeah, that's kind of the framework that I created this body of work from. And, the images, and I'm hoping that the imagery serves as both something that is kind of compelling to get lost in and imaginatively project into, but that also has a certain quality of incompleteness, or the artifice of the situation also becomes clear. I made the dimensions of the drawing to be the same dimensions as like those 80s, 90s CRT monitors with the rounded corners. And there's also areas of the drawings where they start to kind of glitch, or you reach the point of like pixelization where no more information can be found. So they're sort of playing with how thoroughly you can read the image, or how much information is actually there and available to you. So yeah, I think that's kind of the quick overview of what I'm up to in this show.
So cool. I love it. I hope I'm unmuted. Yes, okay. I was just thinking, yeah, I think this is actually kind of a perfect segue, from your patterned and textured work that leads inwards to Mary Little's, actually. Let me just get myself out of this screen sharing mode. Okay. Where is our Mary?
I'm here.
There you are. Let's spotlight you.
I'm trying to hide.
Well, I definitely understand. I feel that deeply. I'm also, I think this is why a lot of us are artists, is that we're not the art. The art is over here.
Yeah.
And, yeah. But please tell us about Black Rock. It's so
Okay.
beautiful and so monumental, and really, really brings the whole show together.
It does look really great in the show. I was really pleasantly surprised when we installed the piece and saw everyone else's work, because it just made complete sense. I can't really put into words how it made sense, but I just felt very comfortable there with the other work. And great to meet the other artists and all of you. So it's been really good to be part of this. And so I don't so much want to talk about this piece, but just talk about maybe my work in more general. And even though I put work on the wall, I think of, and even though I work with a fabric, I think of myself as a sculptor. And I make three-dimensional forms with one single material, which is artist canvas. And my background was I trained as a designer, furniture designer. So I worked with making the three-dimensional forms all through my career, working sculpturally, working with cloth. And the reason I trained as a furniture designer is because I wanted to think about the combination of being rational and being creative and having some kind of a discipline or a rigor behind what I was thinking, and then having an amount of freedom behind the work. This is what I had been doing until I moved to Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, I came here about 8 years ago and stopped making furniture, and felt a huge amount of liberty, not thinking about function any longer, but simply thinking about the aesthetic and thinking about the sculptural qualities that I could bring out in this single material. So, but I still have to have the balance of thinking about the strictness of making patterns, and then the creativity of or the spontaneity of what the cloth does. A lot of my work is geometric. I'm working with repeated forms. And if it was paper or metal, it would be very, very crisp. But because I'm working with soft, pliable material, it takes its own shape at times. So when I hang a piece, you'll see a lot of softness in there. You'll see that each of the little diamonds there are slightly different one from the other, because it's a pliable material. Because it's soft, it falls out. So I always think that I work with light and gravity. I do my part, but then once it's hung up, then it's light and gravity they have their say as well. So in this piece, I had created a form that I had assumed would just hang flat. And then when it hung up, the central piece burst open and came outwards. And that was a really nice element of serendipity in the work. And that's one of the things I enjoy as well, just the idea that I can say what I want to be made, but actually the cloth and gravity and light do their thing as well. So serendipity comes into it. A lot of the work to begin with, when I started making the sculptural works on the wall, were influenced a lot by the landscape where I grew up in Ireland. And I called the first series Drumlins, which is nice, soft forms of landscape that I grew up among, just small hills, nothing angular about them. And I've called the works after neighboring farmers, or a piece of land, or a loch, or a hill, or a small town. I call the works after all of those places or people that come from the past, that come from the Northern Ireland. Wondering what else to say about this. Maybe I would be good at taking questions.
I was thinking that would be good, actually, because I mean, I have so many. I feel like, so I had the privilege of actually doing studio visits with both Astri and Mary, which was not easy in COVID times. But what was so wonderful, and what struck me about the work actually, I think, is that it's like you said, there's so much, there's only so much that you can control about it. Control isn't really the right word. I feel like you take these elements and you have a pattern, but then light and gravity and the way that it's installed, everything also like adds a little bit of something to the piece, takes, makes its mark in a way.
Yeah. So when I make the piece, I maybe will be spending weeks and weeks making one piece, and then I have to have a huge amount of faith that it's going to come together the way that I want. And when I hang it on the wall, get down off the ladder, walk away, turn around, I sometimes see something that is completely unexpected. It opens up in a very strange way, or there's a kind of a shimmery effect, and I have to make some kind of a decision at that point as to whether it's a successful piece of work or not, or whether I have to bring it down and work on it more, sculpt it more. So it's a really good thing to be working with a material-based cloth, or a material. It's a really good thing to be working with a material, because you have to get to know it really sensitively.
Yeah, I think so. Michael, I want to say Rode, but sorry if I'm butchering your last name. They said that what has always struck me about Mary's work is how she transforms the material completely. And I think, I would have to agree that there is, it's a material that's kind of meant to be the supporting element to a painting, let's say. And yet you're making it the star of the show. You're bringing it to the forefront. You're using, you're transforming something that's utilitarian into something that is like its own beautiful organic form.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think it would be good actually to open it up to questions. You don't have to put them in the chat if you have a question for a particular artist. I think put your video on, raise your hand, and you can ask it. But if you want to type it in the chat, that's fine too. Let's see, I'm just going to remove the spotlight so we can all be equal in. Okay, let's see. Oh, everybody's loving the work. Everyone's agreeing. This is fantastic. Well, one thing that I would have to say is, actually, since we were just talking with Mary, I was thinking a lot about how you name your works after landscapes and specific locations, whereas for me they read very bodily and very like I don't know. Some of them are kind of voluptuous and a little bit, evocative of certain shapes. Is that something that you consider in the work as well? Of course.
Yeah, I obviously don't. Well, I don't put it in there intentionally, but I think it all comes out. It's to do with just sensitivity and trying to pull out soft, supple forms from the cloth. And so all sorts of unexpected things happen from that. And I see the body and landscape as really, there's a big overlap. There's a structure and there's a softness and there's worn down elements, and there's a lot of overlap there. So I can say that I'm influenced by both the body and the landscape. I actually enjoy the fact that there's some things that are very sensual about the work, but I don't put them in there intentionally. When I see them, I let them stay.
Yeah. I think Carrie and I we both picked up on it. Wouldn't you say? So would anybody like to ask a question to any of our artists?
I wanted to ask Mary Little a question. I was just wondering, you're talking about sort of like this sense of serendipity, but there does seem to be a very like specific state of like planning, that you're definitely, you have a roadmap and you're following it. And I'm curious to know, how, like, do you just start, you're like, I'm just going to start at this one point and let the pattern grow? Or do you have sort of like a way that you begin and that's like more specific?
Okay, I'm a real planner, and I love the combination of the planning and the serendipity. So every piece is made from pattern making. It's like tailoring or dressmaking, and it's pattern. I make patterns in a 2D drawing program, print them on the paper, cut them out, and then cut out the pieces. So in the Black Rock piece that's in the exhibition, there's 74 pieces in that are all cut out and then sewn together. So yeah, planning and being methodical are a really huge part of my everyday practice. And that, I think, is very good for me emotionally. I think a lot of people are artists because it has an effect on your emotions, and it just makes me feel good to be standing at my cutting table and to know I've got a whole day of cutting or a whole day of sewing. So yeah, the planning and the pattern making are really critical.
Yeah.
I relate to that deeply. Yeah, I'm definitely drawn to work that has repetition and some kind of yeah, you can kind of get lost in the making of it, like you were like a couple artists I think said that when you step back away from it, it sort of reveals itself.
Yeah. I have a question for Mary Beth. Mary Beth, you've when you were making the work with your friend, being covered by her mother's, well, I call it ashes, but you called it something else. Did you take videos of that process, or did any other art form come from that process of doing that, which to me sounded like just a really dramatic experience. I don't know if I could have done that with my mother's ashes. So I'm curious about that.
Thank you so much for that question, Mary. In hindsight, I wish we had, but it was so intense. It was such a big ask. And I think we had three 5-hour sessions to start out for the large body works, and then maybe 3 sessions for the smaller works. And they were durational works. They're really documents of a performance. And it was so intimate. It would have changed the dynamic to have somebody hunkering around with a video camera.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I guess hard enough to be like just really present and be thinking about how I was scooping up the ash and letting it go, and being conscious of Amy Lyford's comfort, because I was afraid she would get cold, or her body would start spazzing because the poses were really awkward. And of course there were ashes in her eyes, in her ears, in her hair, in her, everywhere. That it was, I think I'm relieved that I didn't have to think of myself as an image in that moment, in the way that you do when there's a video camera present. so I could be fully present and with this intimate performance. But of course, in hindsight, I wish we had some documentation of it. Maybe the hand, the hand and the feet were less arduous, and that would have been a good time to get some documentation. Because one of the interesting parts was the sound. And, cremains is an industry word, an American industry word of cremated remains. But what cremated remains are crushed up bone. That's what's left. And the US won't let bone. In other countries, the bones are given to the family. And in fact, in some cultures, the oldest daughter or someone in the family is required to pick bones out and do certain things as part of the memorial process. But in this country, they don't even allow those bones to be visible. They're ground up in this machine, and then only then are they released to the family. And I'm sure it's to make them unrecognizable and nominally looking sort of like something like ashes, but they're not ashes, they're like stones. So the sound of them falling on the paper and her body was like the sound of dropping pebbles. It had this, it almost sounded like one of those rain sticks as well, like where you hear the pebbles falling. So in a sense, I almost wish I had recorded it as much as videotaped it. But thank you for that question.
It was also mostly in the dark, right?
It was in a dark room, so it was very low light, red light. So yes, it was a very low light situation.
Wow.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had muted myself there. It was a very low light situation. It was a dark room with, because it was gelatin silver paper, it was a red light, the typical safe lights.
Thank you. Sorry, got the sound in the background here. Are there any more questions or anything anybody else would like to say or bring up before we?
I saw somebody's hand up earlier, Andre B. Carter. Did you want to ask something? I'm gonna ask to unmute you first.
I didn't really have my hand up. Maybe I was wiggling around, but I have to say, but since you're letting me speak,
sure.
I have to say that each and every one of these artists tonight gave me so much. And it's always great to hear people who are working in other media and how much they love what they do and they believe in what they do. Mary, I think I heard talk at Textile LA one time. Is that correct, Mary? And you blew everybody away. So thank you to all of you very much.
Yeah, I want to just echo that statement by 1,000. I really feel like this is a very special show, and every conversation that I've had with each of you and everybody that's come through to see the pieces, everyone is just blown away and kind of goes from one work to the other and like doesn't really know like where to even land, because it's all just like, it's all so gorgeous and has a lot of depth to it as well. And I'm really proud of an all woman show, I just have to say. Sarah E. Peterson said they feel blown away by the depth as well.
Is it still up? Is the show still up?
Yes, the show is still up, and it's going to be up through March 5th.
Because I'm going to LA this weekend, so tell me where it is.
Great. Oh, okay. So it's at Tiger Strikes Asteroid. I will actually be gallery sitting on Saturday from 1 to 5. So
I'm in a show, so I can't come at that time.
you
But-
and I, you can make an appointment. I would be happy to take you up. You can,
Okay.
yeah, anybody that's on here that can't make it during the open hours, no problem. You can reach out to one of us and we will be happy to meet you and show you around the space.
How do you do that? And I want to bring a person who's a collector, would also enjoy it. Not a collector of mine necessarily, but a big LA collector. So
Fabulous.
Yeah,
I'll put
she would be
all
impressed.
the info into the chat for everyone right now.
That would be great. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
I had a question for the artists, if I can jump in real quick, or are we trying to wrap it now?
No, please go for it.
I was curious if for any of you, after seeing the work together in the space, felt that it opened any new possibilities for you creatively within your own practice. Based on the sort of conversation that was created by the exhibition itself.
Well, I definitely seeing Mary's work. I do another sort of direction of the work that I do is a lot of paper cutting and sculpting works. That's probably a lot different from what you're seeing right now in the gallery. So talking to Mary about her practice and kind of seeing how she's manipulating canvas in ways that kind of brought some new ideas for my work as a paper sculptor. But also I love, that a lot of times I'm very I'm methodical as well, like Mary is, but I don't really think quite, well, I guess I do. The piece that Katja and her husband took to Copenhagen it played with that idea of gravity doing its thing. I did my thing, and now let's see what gravity does as well. So I don't know, I think that was a bit of a kindred spirit. And then with Mary Beth, her just kind of doing this very open-hearted work. I think I kind of hide behind science quite a bit with my work. So seeing what she's doing was really inspiring, and where you can really go if you let yourself be vulnerable enough, right? And then Astri reminding me about my childhood, bringing back that trapper keeper aesthetic, those ideas, and then the choose your own adventure reminders kind of brought me back in this moment of childhood and the joy of that, and the fun of that. So yeah, that's at least how I was influenced by everybody in the show. So thanks ladies.
Yeah, I'd say that one thing just kind of generally I took away from this, and this was partially also from meeting the visit I had with Katja and talking about the ideas of the show. It really made me think much more about the role of the body in my own work, which is interesting because it's not something that I've usually thought about, and I don't normally have much reference or imagery that directly connects to the body. It's a little harder to tell in photographic form or on a screen, but even in my drawings, which are colored pencil and graphite, I'm working to create a surface that almost takes out most of the mark of the hand that you often see in drawing. But with this work, and I think in talking with Katja and then creating the new drawing for the show, it gave me a chance to think about the body of the viewer in relation to the work and the implication of making spaces that you can kind of mentally project into inhabiting, and that sense of leaving space for a body as well as just a mind in approaching the work was definitely something that I have not thought so much about in the past, and I'm really excited to continue to kind of mull over and incorporate into new work as it's developing.
Cool. Yeah, I was thinking for you, it was sort of like what I was drawn to was like, it was like the mind and sort of more about, like what you were saying about conspiracy theories, but I guess the mind is typically housed in a body. Let's see, who else? Anybody? Don't be shy, because otherwise we're gonna wrap it up, and that's gonna be that.
Thank you guys for answering that question. That's great.
Okay, well, I think we've done it. And really, I just want to say one final huge thank you to each and every one of you, everybody who is in the show, Mary Beth, Mary Little, Astri, Mel, and my co-curators and TSA fellows, Carrie and Ricardo. I really feel so grateful that we're back to doing these things, and everybody really brought their A game. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And thank you, everybody, for coming and joining us. This was really great. I have to say, during COVID, having these sort of Zoom artist talks have been kind of the saving grace, because you really get to actually hear from the artists instead of just going to a show. You get to have a little extra special part of it. So thank you all for doing this, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you
So
for
shows up
putting
to-
us in
Yeah, thank you so
conversation,
much.
both artistic and now literal conversation. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been great.
Well, have a great evening, everyone, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, Ricardo. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Guys.